Tonight we're stepping into Colonial Brazil's sugar plantations, not the romanticized version with noble Portuguese settlers, but the brutal reality where human lives were ground up for profit like cane into sugar. You think you understand slavery from textbooks, but the daily horror of plantation life would shatter your assumptions. If you're enjoying these dark histories, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Now settle in, because we're about to explore why you wouldn't survive a single day in the hell that built Brazil's wealth. The screaming starts before dawn, not the wailing of grief. You'll learn to distinguish between different types of screams soon enough, but the raw, animalistic sounds of someone being whipped in the punishment quarters. You're jolted awake in the cramped slave quarters, your body pressed against dozens of others on the bare wooden floor. The stench hits you immediately. Unwashed bodies, human waste, infected wounds, and the sickly sweet smell of gangrene that means someone won't live through the week. Your name is Joe, though the Portuguese overseer calls you boy or worse. You're 15, though you feel ancient after 3 years on this sugar plantation outside Salvador. The woman next to you, Maria, sits up slowly, her back a roadmap of scars from countless beatings. She's maybe 30 but looks 50, her youth stolen by endless labor under the Brazilian sun. Her infant daughter, little Anna, clings to her breast, one of the lucky ones born into this hell. The wooden door explodes open and Senor Carlos, the overseer, storms in with his leather whip already uncoiled. His pale skin is permanently flushed red from alcohol and rage, his Portuguese accent thick with contempt. "Get up, you lazy animals. The cane won't cut itself." His eyes scan the room like a predator selecting prey. You've learned to avoid eye contact, it only invites violence. But today something's different. Carlos's usual swagger seems forced, and there's fear in his eyes. Behind him stands a figure that makes your blood freeze. Padre Francisco, the plantation priest. The holy man's presence in the slave quarters at dawn means only one thing: someone's about to die, and he's here to perform last rites. Or worse, someone's about to be sold, families torn apart forever. Maria clutches Anna tighter, and you see the terror in her eyes. Yesterday, you overheard the Portuguese master, Dom Miguel, arguing with a slave trader about prices. The sugar harvest has been poor, debts are mounting, and slaves are the most liquid asset on a failing plantation. The question isn't whether someone will be sold today, it's who. The punishment screams stop abruptly. Either the victim has passed out or died. In the sudden silence, you hear something that makes your stomach clench, the sound of chains. Heavy iron chains being dragged across the courtyard. Your eyes meet Maria's and you both know. Today, families will be destroyed. Carlos cracks his whip against the doorframe. You have 5 minutes to get to the fields. Anyone not at their station when the bell rings gets 20 lashes. He pauses, savoring the power, then adds with a cruel smile, "And Padre Francisco has some announcements to make after morning prayers." As bodies scramble around you in the pre-dawn darkness, you notice something else that chills you to the bone. Old Vicent, the plantation's most experienced cane cutter, isn't moving. The 70-year-old man who's worked these fields for 30 years lies motionless on his sleeping mat. In the dim light, you can't tell if he's breathing. Maria whispers urgently in your ear, "If Vicent's dead, they'll work someone else to death to replace him by Christmas. Dom Miguel won't accept reduced production." Her words hang in the air like a death sentence. You've seen this pattern before. When an experienced worker dies, the quotas don't decrease. They simply demand the impossible from those who remain. The iron chains grow louder, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the slave traders entering the compound. Through the wooden slats, you catch a glimpse of a sight that's haunted your nightmares for 3 years. Children, some as young as 8, shackled together in a line. Fresh arrivals from the African coast, about to learn what hell looks like under the Brazilian sun. But there's something else, something that makes even hardened overseer Carlos nervous. The Portuguese master Dom Miguel hasn't been seen for 2 days, and strange men in fine clothes have been visiting the plantation house. Men who don't look like they're here to buy sugar. Men who look like they're here to collect debts. You realize with growing horror that this plantation, your hell, but also the only home you've known for 3 years, might be changing hands entirely. And in colonial Brazil, when plantations change ownership, slaves rarely survive the transition intact. New owners mean new rules, new quotas, and usually a complete reorganization of the slave population. The morning bell tolls, its bronze voice carrying across the plantation like a funeral dirge. Around you, shadows move with practiced efficiency toward their daily torment. But as you stand to join them, you notice Maria isn't moving. She's staring at something in the corner where Vicent lies. "Joe," she whispers, her voice barely audible, "Vicent's not dead. He's awake, and he's trying to tell us something." You crawl toward Vicent's corner, your heart hammering against your ribs. The old man's eyes are open, alert, but his body remains perfectly still. Smart. If Carlos thinks he's dead, he might be spared today's brutality. Vicent's lips barely move as you lean close, Maria beside you with Anna pressed against her chest. "The ships," he breathes, each word costing him enormous effort. "3 ships in the harbor, not Portuguese." His weathered hand, scarred from decades of machete work, grips your wrist with surprising strength. "English. The English are coming." Your blood turns to ice. Everyone knows what English ships mean: war, conquest, the complete destruction of the Portuguese colonial system. But more immediately terrifying, when colonial powers change hands, slaves become expendable. The English might free you, they might work you harder, or they might simply eliminate you as Portuguese property. There's no way to know which fate awaits. Maria's breathing quickens. "How do you know?" she whispers. Vicent's eyes dart toward the small window. "Heard Dom Miguel talking to the priest last night. The English took Recife. They're moving south. Dom Miguel's selling everything before they arrive, including us." The implications crash over you like a tidal wave. The mysterious visitors, the slave traders, Carlos's nervous energy, it all makes horrifying sense. Dom Miguel isn't just selling a few slaves to cover debts. He's liquidating his entire human property before the English arrive and potentially free everyone. Outside, Carlos's voice booms across the courtyard. "Form lines. Anyone not in formation in 30 seconds answers to my whip." But beneath his usual bluster, you detect something you've never heard before: desperation. Even the overseers know their world is ending. Anna starts crying, her infant wails cutting through the morning air like knife blades. Maria rocks her frantically, knowing that crying babies often disappeared on plantations, another mouth to feed that produced no labor. "SHH, Minha filha, SHH, she pleads, but the baby's distress seems to sense the terror surrounding her. Vicent struggles to sit up, his movements careful and deliberate. "There's more," he gasps. "The priest. He's not here for last rites. He's documenting the slave inventory for sale. Every person, every family, every child. They're cataloging us like livestock." You feel your world tilting. For 3 years, you've survived by understanding the rhythms of plantation life, learning when to disappear, when to work harder, when to submit completely. But now all those survival instincts are useless. The game has changed entirely, and you don't know the new rules. Through the wooden walls, you hear voices speaking rapid Portuguese, Dom Miguel arguing with someone about prices per head. The words bulk sale and immediate transport drift through the air. Your hands start shaking. Bulk sale doesn't mean individual transactions where families might stay together. It means loading everyone onto ships like cargo, destination unknown. Maria grabs your arm so tightly her fingernails draw blood. "My sister Rosa," she breathes. "She's in the big house, caring for the master's children, if they're selling everyone." She doesn't finish the sentence, but you understand. Rosa has been protected by her position as a house slave, but if Dom Miguel is liquidating everything, nowhere is safe. The footsteps of the slave traders grow louder, accompanied by the metallic scraping of shackles. Through gaps in the wall, you see them examining slaves like cattle, checking teeth, feeling muscles, making notes on wooden tablets. One trader, a heavy-set man with gold teeth, points toward your quarters and says something that makes Carlos nod grimly. Vicent pulls you closer, his breath hot against your ear. Listen carefully. The English ships, they're not just warships. Some carry abolitionists, people who believe slavery should end. His eyes burn with an intensity you've never seen. But Dom Miguel knows this. He's not just selling us to other Portuguese. He's selling to Dutch traders who will take us to their Caribbean plantations where the English can't reach us. Your mind reels. Freedom so close you can almost taste it, but escape impossible because you're about to be sold into an even worse hell. The Dutch sugar plantations in the Caribbean are legendary for their brutality, places where slaves are worked to death within years, because replacing them is cheaper than keeping them alive. Anna's crying intensifies, and Maria's face contorts with desperation. "I can't let them take her," she whispers, and you see something terrible forming in her eyes, the look of a mother contemplating the unthinkable to save her child from a lifetime of agony. The wooden door explodes open again, but this time it's not Carlos. 3 men enter, a Portuguese slave trader with ledger books, a Dutch captain with cruel eyes and scarred hands, and behind them, Padre Francisco clutching his Bible like a shield. The priest's face is pale, his hands trembling. Even he seems horrified by what's about to happen. The trader points at Vicent and speaks in rapid Portuguese to the Dutch captain, who shakes his head dismissively. "Too old, too weak, not worth transport costs." Vicent's eyes meet yours, and you realize he might be the lucky one today, worthless enough to avoid the nightmare awaiting the rest of you. But then the Dutch captain's gaze sweeps the room and lands on Maria and Anna. His eyes light up with the cold calculation of profit. Young mother, healthy baby, perfect for breeding programs on Caribbean plantations. Maria sees his stare and instinctively backs against the wall, clutching Anna so tightly the baby screams louder. The trader makes marks in his ledger. The Dutch captain nods approval. Padre Francisco closes his eyes and mumbles what might be prayers or simply attempts to maintain his sanity while facilitating the sale of human souls. And you realize with crystalline clarity that you have perhaps hours, maybe less, before you're loaded onto ships that will carry you away from Brazil forever, away from everything you've ever known, toward a fate that makes even this plantation look merciful by comparison. Vicent grabs your hand one final time. "Remember the English ships," he whispers as the traders turn their attention to you. 3 ships, if there's any chance, any opportunity." He doesn't finish, but his meaning is clear. Hope is a dangerous thing for a slave to carry, but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps you human. The Dutch captain approaches, and you see your reflection in his cold eyes. A 15-year-old boy about to disappear into the machinery of colonial commerce, becoming just another entry in a ledger book that will seal your fate forever. The Dutch captain's calloused hands grab your chin, tilting your head left and right like you're a horse he's considering purchasing. His breath reeks of rum and tobacco as he examines your teeth, pressing his thumb against your gums to check for disease. You force yourself to remain still, knowing that any resistance will only make things worse for everyone in this room. "This one's strong," he says in broken Portuguese to the trader. "Good teeth, no visible sickness. How old?" The trader consults his ledger, making calculations that will determine whether you live or die in the coming months. 15, Capital. Been here 3 years, knows the work. The trader's voice is matter of fact, discussing your life like he's selling livestock. No history of running, no disciplinary problems. You want to laugh bitterly at that assessment. No history of running, because where would you go? No disciplinary problems, because you've learned that survival means absolute submission. But the Dutch captain nods approvingly, and you see him make a mark in his own book, a mark that seals your fate. Behind you, Maria has gone eerily quiet. When you glance back, you see why. She's slowly backing toward the corner where plantation tools are kept. A rusty machete leans against the wall, left there by some careless overseer. Your blood freezes as you realize what she's contemplating. In her mind, killing Anna and herself is preferable to watching her daughter grow up in Caribbean hell. The Portuguese trader moves to examine other slaves, but the Dutch captain remains focused on your corner. His eyes shift from you to Maria, and his expression changes from commercial interest to something far more predatory. "The woman with the baby," he says, pointing. "She's young enough for breeding. The child will adapt quickly if we start training early." Padre Francisco flinches at the word breeding, but says nothing. His complicity in this horror weighs on his face like a physical burden, but he continues making notes for the church records that will legitimize this sale in the eyes of God and Portuguese law. Vicent, still feigning death beside you, makes the slightest movement, his hand sliding toward a loose floorboard. You've never noticed it before, but now you see it. A hiding place, perhaps containing something valuable enough to change the situation. But what could an old slave possibly have hidden that would matter to Dutch traders? The examination continues with mechanical efficiency. Children are assessed for their ability to learn complex tasks. Adults are evaluated for their remaining productive years. The elderly are dismissed as transport costs exceeding potential profit. Each person's worth is calculated in guilders and reals, human lives reduced to columns of numbers. Maria's hand inches closer to the machete handle. Anna has stopped crying, perhaps sensing her mother's desperation. The silence from the baby is somehow more terrifying than her earlier wails. It's the quiet of a child who's already learned that crying brings only pain. Suddenly, commotion erupts outside, shouting in Portuguese, then answering calls in what sounds like English. The Dutch captain's head snaps toward the window, his face shifting from confidence to concern. The English ships Vicent mentioned, they're not just in the harbor anymore. They're landing troops. Carlos's voice cuts through the morning air, high-pitched with panic. "The English. They're at the main gate." The sound of running feet follows, overseers and guards scrambling to defensive positions that everyone knows are hopeless against a determined English force. The Portuguese trader looks stricken. "Capital, if we don't load immediately." He doesn't finish the sentence, but the implication hangs heavy. If the English take the plantation before the slaves can be transported, this entire transaction becomes worthless, or worse, evidence of illegal trafficking. The Dutch captain's demeanor transforms instantly. Gone is the careful examination, replaced by urgent calculation. "How many can we take immediately?" he demands. "No time for full processing. We load now and sort later." Your heart hammers as you realize the implications. Instead of careful selection, they're about to grab everyone they can and stuff them into ship holds like grain sacks. The slight hope that some might be spared evaporates. They're taking everyone who can walk. Vicent's hand moves more urgently toward the loose floorboard. Whatever he's hidden there, he needs to reach it before the chaos fully erupts. His weathered fingers work at the wood, trying to pry it loose without attracting attention. Maria's breathing becomes rapid and shallow. Her hand is now inches from the machete handle, her eyes fixed on Anna with the terrifying focus of a mother who's made an unthinkable decision. You realize with horror that you might be about to witness something that will haunt you forever, if you live long enough to be haunted by anything. The English voices grow louder, closer. Through the walls, you hear Dom Miguel shouting orders to his overseer, then the sound of papers being burned, evidence of the slave sales going up in smoke. But the evidence walking around on two legs can't be destroyed so easily. Padre Francisco drops his Bible, the sacred book hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. His hands shake as he reaches for it, and you see tears streaming down his face. "Forgive me," he whispers, though whether he's talking to God, to you, or to himself is unclear. The Dutch captain barks orders to his crew waiting outside. "Bring the chains, all of them. We leave in 10 minutes." The sound of iron shackles being dragged across stone fills the air like the rattling of skeleton bones. Vicent's fingers finally work the floorboard loose. What he pulls out makes your eyes widen in shock, not gold or jewelry, but a letter sealed with red wax. A letter that, by its formal appearance, could only be official Portuguese documentation. But what kind of papers would an old slave possess? Maria's hand closes around the machete handle. Anna looks up at her mother with trusting eyes, not understanding that this might be their last moment together. The terrible mathematics of desperation play out on Maria's face as she weighs the agony of murder against the horror of letting her daughter live as plantation property. The Dutch captain turns back to survey his new acquisitions, and his eyes immediately lock onto the machete in Maria's trembling grip. His hand moves to the pistol at his belt with practiced ease. "Drop it," he commands in Portuguese, his voice deadly calm. "Drop it now, or I kill you both anyway." But Maria doesn't drop the weapon. Instead, she raises it higher, her knuckles white with desperate strength. "You cannot have her," she whispers, her voice carrying across the room like a prayer and a curse combined. "I will not let you turn my daughter into what you've made me." The standoff freezes everyone in the room. The Dutch captain's hand hovers over his pistol grip. Maria's machete glints in the morning light streaming through the window. Anna gurgles softly, unaware that her fate hangs in the balance of her mother's terrible choice. And outside, the sound of English boots grows closer, accompanied by voices speaking in crisp military cadence. Whatever happens in the next few seconds will determine not just whether you live or die, but whether you face that fate as families or as strangers scattered across the Caribbean like seeds in a hurricane. Vicent clutches his mysterious letter tighter, and you realize that whatever secrets it contains might be the only thing standing between all of you and complete destruction. The machete trembles in Maria's grip as the Dutch captain's fingers wrap around his pistol handle. Time stretches like molten sugar, every second an eternity of suspended terror. Anna reaches up toward her mother's face with tiny fingers, and that innocent gesture seems to break something fundamental in Maria's resolve. But before anyone can move, Vicent does something that shocks everyone in the room. He sits up fully and speaks in clear, strong Portuguese. "Captain," he says, his voice carrying an authority that makes even the Dutch traitor step back. "Before you shoot anyone, you might want to see this." He holds up the letter with its red wax seal, and you notice something that makes your breath catch. The seal isn't just any mark. It bears the distinctive cross and crown of the Portuguese royal administration. Vicent, an old slave who should barely be able to read, is holding official government correspondence. The Dutch captain's eyes narrow as he takes in this unexpected development. His hand remains on his pistol, but curiosity wars with urgency in his expression. "What is that, old man?" Vicent struggles to his feet, moving with deliberate slowness to avoid triggering violence. "A letter from Governor-General Salvador Correa de Sá e Benavides," he says, and the formal name drops into the room like a stone into still water. "Regarding the illegal sale of baptized slaves during wartime." The Portuguese trader's face goes white. Baptized slaves hold a different legal status in Portuguese colonial law. They cannot be sold to non-Catholic powers without specific royal permission. The Dutch captain, despite his ruthless demeanor, knows that trafficking baptized slaves to Protestant nations carries penalties that even his maritime connections cannot protect him from. But Vicent isn't finished. "Furthermore," he continues, unfolding the letter with careful precision, "this document identifies specific slaves who have served as witnesses in criminal proceedings against plantation owners. Under Portuguese law, such witnesses cannot be transported outside colonial jurisdiction until their testimony is complete." Your mind reels. Vicent can not only read, but he understands complex legal terminology. More shocking still, he seems to be suggesting that some of you are under official protection, a protection that could destroy Dom Miguel and his collaborators if violated. Maria's machete wavers as confusion replaces desperation in her eyes. The immediate threat of family separation suddenly seems less certain, though no less terrifying. Anna chooses this moment to laugh, a pure, innocent sound that cuts through the tension like a blade through silk. The Dutch captain releases his pistol grip and snatches the letter from Vicent's hands. His eyes scan the Portuguese text with surprising fluency, and with each line he reads, his expression grows darker. Finally, he looks up at the Portuguese trader with undisguised fury. "You didn't tell me about witness protection," he growls. "You didn't mention baptismal records. You're asking me to transport evidence in criminal proceedings involving the Portuguese crown." The trader stammers, clearly caught off guard by Vicent's revelation. The old man is lying. He cannot read. Slaves do not possess government correspondence." But Vicent cuts him off with a laugh that carries decades of suppressed knowledge. "I was secretary to Judge Antonio Vieira before Dom Miguel purchased me to silence my testimony about his illegal sugar tax schemes. I have been waiting 3 years for the opportunity to produce this letter." The room explodes into chaos. The Portuguese trader lunges for Vicent, trying to seize the letter, but the old man proves surprisingly agile. The Dutch captain draws his pistol, but now he's aiming at the trader rather than the slaves. Padre Francisco drops to his knees, frantically searching for his fallen Bible as if the holy book might protect him from the legal catastrophe unfolding around him. Through this confusion, you hear something that makes your heart leap. English voices, much closer now. "Secure the plantation house. Check all buildings for resistance." The accent is crisp, military, and utterly alien after years of Portuguese and occasional Dutch commands. Maria finally lowers her machete, but instead of relief, her face shows calculating intelligence. "If Vicent is telling the truth," she whispers to you, "then some of us cannot be legally sold. But which ones? And what happens to the others?" The Portuguese trader recovers his balance and pulls a knife from his belt. "Letter or no letter," he snarls, "dead slaves tell no stories to Portuguese judges." He advances on Vicent with clear murderous intent, but the old man doesn't retreat. Instead, Vicent does something extraordinary. He begins reciting names and dates from memory. Maria Santos, purchased illegally from the estate of Carlos Mendes. Joe Silva, transported without required documentation from Bahia. Ana Santos, born on plantation property but never registered with colonial authorities. You realize with growing amazement that Vicent has been memorizing illegal activities for 3 years, building a case that could destroy not just Dom Miguel, but the entire network of corrupt officials who enable the plantation system. His mind is a living document of crimes that powerful men assumed would never be recorded. The Dutch captain lowers his pistol completely, his business instincts overriding his greed. "This is not worth the risk," he declares to the Portuguese trader. "Find me slaves without legal complications, or our transaction is void." But the trader has moved beyond rational calculation into desperate fury. His knife glints as he closes distance with Vicent, murder clear in his eyes. "Too late for complications, old man. Too late for everyone." The blade arcs toward Vicent's throat, and you know you have seconds to act. But before you can move, Maria explodes into motion. The machete she'd intended for her daughter's mercy becomes Vicent's salvation, the rusty blade intercepting the trader's knife with a clang that echoes off the wooden walls. "No more death today," she declares, her voice carrying a strength you've never heard before. "No more." The trader staggers backward, clutching a wounded hand where Maria's machete found its mark. Blood drips onto the floor where you've slept for 3 years, and somehow that seems symbolically appropriate. The ground where you've suffered is finally receiving the blood of your oppressors. Outside, English voices grow urgent. Movement in the slave quarters. Approach with caution. Footsteps surround the building, and you realize the moment of truth has arrived. In seconds, English soldiers will burst through that door, and everything will change forever. The Dutch captain holsters his pistol and backs toward the window. "This plantation is compromised," he announces. "I want no part of English military tribunals." He begins climbing through the opening, abandoning his human cargo without a second thought. Vicent clutches his letter protectively, while helping Maria restrain the bleeding traitor. Padre Francisco rocks back and forth on his knees, muttering prayers in Latin that sound more like pleas for forgiveness than requests for divine intervention. And you stand in the center of it all, a 15-year-old boy whose world has turned upside down in the space of 10 minutes. Freedom might be walking through that door in the form of English soldiers, but freedom comes with its own terrors. What happens to plantation slaves when their masters disappear? What happens to people whose only skills involve cutting sugar cane and surviving daily brutality? The footsteps stop just outside the door. A voice calls out in accented Portuguese, "We are English Liberation Forces. Exit slowly with hands visible." The moment you've dreamed of and feared in equal measure has finally arrived. Vicent looks at you with eyes that suddenly seem ancient and infinitely wise. "Remember, Joe," he whispers urgently. "Whatever happens next, you are not property. You never were property. That letter proves it, and now the English are here to enforce it." The door handle turns slowly, and sunlight begins to spill into your prison as the barrier between slavery and freedom dissolves before your eyes. The door swings open, and 2 English soldiers step into the cramped quarters, their red uniforms a stark contrast against the drab wooden walls. The first man, a sergeant by his stripes, surveys the scene with experienced eyes that have clearly witnessed colonial brutality before. Behind him, a younger soldier grips his musket nervously, his face pale at the stench and squalor that assault his senses. "Jesus Christ," the younger soldier mutters in English, then catches himself and switches to broken Portuguese. "Everyone, safe now, English protection." But you can see uncertainty in both men's faces as they take in the tableau before them. Vicent clutching an official letter, Maria holding a bloody machete over a wounded Portuguese trader, Padre Francisco mumbling prayers on his knees, and dozens of slaves pressed against the walls in terror. This isn't the simple liberation scenario they'd been prepared for. The sergeant's gaze immediately fixes on Vicent's letter. Years of colonial administration have taught him to recognize official documents, and the red wax seal commands his attention. "You," he says in careful Portuguese, pointing at Vicent. "What is that paper?" Vicent straightens with dignity that seems to surprise the soldiers. Official correspondence from Governor-General Salvador Correa de Sá e Benavides, establishing witness protection for specific individuals on this plantation. His educated accent catches both men off guard. Educated slaves are not something their military briefings prepared them to encounter. Maria steps protectively in front of Anna, the machete still dripping blood from the trader's wounded hand. The sergeant notices the defensive posture and raises his hand in what he hopes is a calming gesture. "We are not here to harm you," he says. "English policy prohibits slavery. You are, how do you say, free." The word free hangs in the air like smoke from a guttering candle. Around you, other slaves whisper the Portuguese translation, "liver," as if testing whether the word might burn their tongues. But freedom, you're beginning to understand, is more complicated than simply walking out of chains. The wounded trader, still clutching his bleeding hand, sees an opportunity in the soldier's confusion. "These are dangerous criminals," he shouts in Portuguese, gambling that the English won't understand his rapid speech. "They attacked me. The old man steals official documents. The woman is a murderer." But Vicent responds in fluent English, and his accent carries the precision of formal education. "Gentlemen, this man has been engaged in illegal trafficking of baptized Portuguese subjects. The letter I carry contains evidence of violations that extend to the highest levels of colonial administration." Both soldiers stare at Vicent in shock. An elderly African slave who speaks perfect English and possesses legal documents is so far outside their experience that they struggle to process what they're witnessing. The younger soldier lowers his musket completely, while the sergeant steps closer to examine the letter. "You speak English," the sergeant states, disbelief evident in his voice. "I was educated by Jesuit missionaries before being illegally enslaved," Vicent replies calmly. "As were several others here, we have been awaiting English intervention to restore our legal status." The implications crash over you like a wave. Vicent isn't just an old slave who learned to read. He's an educated man who was illegally enslaved, possibly a free man of color whose rights were violated for economic gain. If his story is true, then some people in this room might never have been legal slaves at all. Maria looks at Vicent with new understanding. "You knew," she whispers in Portuguese. "You knew the English were coming. You knew they would need evidence." Vicent nods gravely. "I have been preparing for this day for 3 years. Every illegal transaction, every violation of Portuguese law, every death that could have been prevented, I have documented it all in my memory." The sergeant is now reading the letter, his frown deepening with each line. Portuguese colonial law is complex, but certain violations are clear even to foreign observers. The sale of baptized slaves to Protestant nations, the trafficking of protected witnesses, the enslavement of previously free persons, these are crimes that even English military law recognizes. "This document," the sergeant begins, then stops as shouting erupts from outside. Heavy footsteps approach, accompanied by the clank of chains and Dom Miguel's voice raised in desperate Portuguese. "Release my property immediately. These are legal transactions under Portuguese colonial law." Through the doorway, you see a sight that fills you with both hope and terror. Dom Miguel in iron shackles, flanked by English soldiers. His fine clothes are torn, his usual arrogance replaced by sweating panic. Behind him, Carlos the overseer stumbles along in similar chains, blood running from a cut above his eye. The sight of their tormentors in chains sends a ripple of emotion through the slave quarters. Some people begin crying with relief, others with fear of retribution, still others with the overwhelming confusion of seeing their world's power structure completely inverted. But Dom Miguel's eyes immediately find Vicent and the letter in the sergeant's hands. His face contorts with rage and terror. That slave stole confidential correspondence. He is a criminal and a liar. You cannot trust the word of plantation property. Vicent's response is delivered with the calm authority of a man who has waited years for this moment. "I am not plantation property, Dom Miguel. I never was. And this letter proves that you have known this for 3 years." The Portuguese trader, still bleeding, seizes this moment to make his own desperate play. "The old slave is correct," he shouts, pointing at Dom Miguel. "He forced me to buy illegally enslaved persons. I am a victim of his crimes." Chaos erupts as everyone begins talking at once. Dom Miguel screams denials in Portuguese. The trader accuses him in broken English. Padre Francisco mutters prayers that sound increasingly like confessions, and slaves throughout the quarters whisper urgent conversations about what this all means for their futures. The sergeant raises his hand for silence, his military authority cutting through the noise. "Enough," he barks. Then, looking directly at Vicent, he continues in English. "Sir, if what you claim is true, then this situation requires immediate investigation by colonial authorities." The word "sir," directed at an African slave, makes everyone freeze. In 3 years on this plantation, you have never heard any white person address a slave with basic courtesy, let alone the respectful title reserved for free men. The social order you've known is crumbling before your eyes. Maria clutches Anna tighter, and you see calculation in her eyes. If some slaves are actually free persons who were illegally enslaved, what does that mean for those who were legally enslaved? Will the English free everyone equally, or will legal distinctions create new hierarchies among the liberated? Vicent seems to read her thoughts. The English policy, he says carefully, is abolition of slavery entirely within their territories. Legal status under Portuguese law becomes irrelevant under English administration. Hope blooms in your chest, but it's tinged with terror. Freedom without preparation is its own kind of death sentence. Where will you live? How will you eat? What skills do you possess beyond cutting sugar cane and avoiding beatings? The plantation system is evil, but it's also the only economic structure you've ever known. The younger English soldier who has been quietly observing suddenly speaks up in heavily accented Portuguese. "My captain," he says, "there is ship to take people who want to go to English colonies, to work for wages, real wages." This revelation sends another shock through the assembled slaves. The possibility of wage labor being paid for work rather than simply kept alive to continue working is so foreign that many struggle to comprehend it. But you also hear the unspoken implications. Those who cannot work, the elderly and sick, may face starvation in this new free world. Dom Miguel, seeing his entire world collapsing, makes one final desperate attempt to maintain control. "You English fools," he shouts. "Do you think these people can govern themselves? Do you think they can survive without Portuguese guidance? You will create chaos and death." But his words ring hollow in light of the chaos and death he has already created. Vicent looks at him with something approaching pity. "Dom Miguel, in 3 years you have proven that Portuguese guidance creates only suffering. Perhaps it is time to discover what self-governance might accomplish." The confrontation between master and slave, witnessed by English soldiers who represent a new colonial power, crystallizes the historical moment you're living through. The old order is dying, but the new order remains undefined and terrifying in its uncertainty. Outside, more voices call in, English officers requiring reports, soldiers securing the plantation buildings, administrators beginning the complex process of documenting Portuguese colonial crimes for international tribunals. Your personal drama is playing out against the backdrop of imperial transition, and you realize that your individual fate is tied to forces far larger than anything you've previously imagined. The sergeant folds Vicent's letter carefully and places it in his jacket pocket. "This evidence will be forwarded to English colonial authorities," he announces. "In the meantime, all persons on this plantation are under English protection." But protection, you're learning, is not the same as salvation. The sergeant's words about English protection have barely settled when a new commotion erupts outside. Heavy wagon wheels creak across the courtyard, accompanied by voices speaking in rapid English and the distinctive sound of administrative chaos, papers rustling, orders being shouted, the scratch of quills on parchment. Through the doorway, you glimpse something that makes your stomach clench. English clerks setting up tables and ledgers, preparing to document every person on the plantation. Maria sees it too, and her grip on Anna tightens until the baby whimpers. "They're counting us," she whispers, and you hear the fear in her voice. Just like the Portuguese, just like Dom Miguel. The prospect of being catalogued again, even by liberators, awakens the deep terror that comes from being treated as inventory rather than human beings. Vicent notices the documentation process and his expression grows troubled. "The English mean well," he says quietly, "but they do not understand that freedom cannot be administered like colonial policy. You cannot simply declare people free and expect them to know how to live freely." Dom Miguel, still in chains but somehow sensing an opportunity in the confusion, calls out desperately to the English sergeant. "You see, already they resist your authority. Slaves cannot comprehend freedom, they require structure, guidance, firm control. His words drip with the condescension of 3 years of absolute power, but now they sound pathetic rather than threatening. The younger English soldier glances nervously between the documentation tables and the assembled slaves. His training prepared him for military conquest, not the complex human realities of liberation. "Sergeant," he says uncertainly, "the captain wants a full count within the hour. Names, ages, skills, physical condition." He trails off as he realizes he's describing the same inventory process used by slave traders. Around you, other slaves begin to understand what's happening. An elderly woman named Rosa, Maria's sister, you realize with shock, pushes through the crowd from where she's been hiding since the commotion began. Her house slave clothing is torn and dirty, suggesting she's been running through the plantation grounds. "Maria," she calls out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Are you safe? Is Anna?" The reunion between sisters unfolds against the backdrop of imperial transition. Their embrace a moment of pure human connection in the midst of administrative chaos. Anna reaches toward her aunt with delighted giggles, the only person in this room whose joy is uncomplicated by understanding of what freedom might cost. But Rosa's arrival brings disturbing news. "The English soldiers searched the big house," she whispers urgently to Maria. "They found Dom Miguel's private records, lists of slaves he planned to sell, debts he owes to Portuguese merchants, correspondence with Dutch traders." Her eyes dart toward Vicent. "And they found documents about witnesses in colonial court cases." Vicent's face hardens. "What kind of documents?" "Records of testimony you gave before Judge Vieira. Records of other slaves who witnessed illegal activities. And," Rosa's voice drops to barely audible levels, "records of people who died to prevent their testimony." The blood drains from your face as the full scope of Dom Miguel's criminal enterprise becomes clear. Vicent hasn't just been documenting illegal slave sales. He's been gathering evidence about murders committed to silence witnesses. The plantation you've lived on for 3 years is literally built on a foundation of corpses. The Portuguese trader, still clutching his wounded hand, overhears Rosa's whispered revelations and begins backing toward the window. His earlier bravado has evaporated, replaced by the pure panic of a man who realizes his crimes are about to be fully exposed. But the young English soldier notices his movement and raises his musket with surprising competence. "Stay where you are," the soldier commands in broken Portuguese. "No one leaves until documentation is complete." Dom Miguel's face has gone ashen as he processes Rosa's news about his private records being discovered. 3 years of careful criminal conspiracy are unraveling in front of English witnesses who will report everything to authorities beyond Portuguese colonial influence. "You do not understand," he pleads desperately with the sergeant. "These slaves lie. They invent stories to justify rebellion." But Vicent produces another shock that silences everyone in the room. From beneath his ragged shirt, he pulls out a small cloth bundle that he unwraps with reverent care. Inside are 3 items that make even the English soldiers step back in amazement: a silver cross bearing the seal of the Jesuit order, a letter written in Latin script, and most shocking of all, a small book bound in leather with his name, Vicent de Silva, inscribed on the cover in gold lettering. "I am Vicent de Silva," he announces with quiet dignity, "ordained deacon of the Society of Jesus, educated at the University of Coimbra, and illegally enslaved by Dom Miguel to prevent my testimony about his theft of church funds intended for indigenous mission work." The revelation explodes through the room like a musket blast. Vicent isn't just an educated slave, he's an ordained member of the Catholic clergy, a man whose enslavement violates not only Portuguese colonial law but international church doctrine. Dom Miguel hasn't just committed crimes against the colonial administration, he's committed sacrilege against the Catholic Church itself. Padre Francisco, who has been silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly looks up from his prayers with an expression of absolute horror. "Deacon Vicent," he whispers, "but you were reported dead, killed by indigenous raiders during mission work." Vicent's laugh is bitter but not unkind. "Reported dead by the same man who arranged my capture and sale. Dom Miguel needed church witnesses eliminated, and what better way than to make a deacon simply disappear into the plantation system?" The implications cascade through your mind like falling dominoes. If Vicent is telling the truth, then Dom Miguel's crimes extend far beyond illegal slave trading into conspiracy, murder, theft from the church, and the systematic elimination of witnesses. No wonder the English soldiers seem overwhelmed. They've stumbled into evidence of criminal conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Portuguese colonial society. Maria stares at Vicent with new understanding. "That's why you could read the letters. That's why you knew Portuguese law. You weren't learning, you were remembering." The sergeant has gone pale as he realizes the magnitude of what he's discovered. An ordained Catholic deacon, illegally enslaved on a Portuguese plantation, represents a diplomatic catastrophe that could justify English intervention in Portuguese colonial affairs for decades to come. This isn't just about liberating slaves anymore. It's about exposing systematic criminal conspiracy by Portuguese colonial authorities. "Sir," the sergeant says to Vicent, his tone now carrying genuine respect, "I must ask you to accompany me to speak with my commanding officer. This situation requires immediate attention from the highest levels of English colonial administration." But before Vicent can respond, the Portuguese trader makes his desperate break for freedom. Despite his wounded hand, he lunges toward the window with surprising speed. The young English soldier's musket tracks his movement, but in the confined space, a shot risks hitting innocent slaves pressed against the walls. Maria reacts with lightning reflexes born from 3 years of surviving plantation violence. Her machete flashes through the air, not to kill but to trip, sending the trader crashing into the wall just short of the window. He crumples to the floor, consciousness lost, blood pooling from a scalp wound that looks serious but not fatal. "No one else dies today," Maria repeats firmly, but this time her words carry the authority of someone who has saved lives rather than taken them. The demonstration of controlled violence, enough to stop a threat, but not enough to kill, impresses both English soldiers. They're seeing not savage plantation slaves, but people capable of measured judgment under extreme pressure. People who might indeed be capable of the self-governance that English colonial policy theoretically supports. Rosa clutches Anna close to her chest while examining the unconscious trader. "He's breathing," she reports. "He'll live to face English justice." Outside, the administrative commotion grows louder as more English officials arrive to process what they're discovering. Voices call out in urgent English, and you catch fragments that suggest this plantation's evidence is being viewed as far more significant than anyone initially realized. Vicent carefully rewraps his clerical items, but not before showing the Latin letter to Padre Francisco. The plantation priest reads it quickly, his face growing more distressed with each line. Finally, he looks up at Vicent with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Forgive me, Deacon," he whispers. "I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to ask questions. I chose comfort over truth." Vicent's response carries the weight of genuine pastoral authority. "Fear is understandable, Father, but now we must choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience." The conversation between the two clergy members, one enslaved, one complicit, crystallizes the moral complexity of colonial life. Even religious authority has been corrupted by the economic incentives of the plantation system, but redemption remains possible for those willing to confront their failures honestly. You realize that you're witnessing something historically unprecedented. The complete collapse of Portuguese colonial authority in real time, documented by English witnesses who will carry this evidence to international tribunals. Your personal liberation is unfolding against the backdrop of imperial transition that will reshape the entire region. But liberation brings its own terrors, and as English administrators continue documenting everyone's status outside, you wonder whether freedom will prove to be salvation or simply a different form of uncertainty in a world where survival still depends on forces beyond your control. The English captain arrives with a flourish of military efficiency that makes even the seasoned sergeant straighten his posture. Captain William Hartwell is a man in his 40s, his uniform impeccable despite the tropical heat, his eyes sharp with the intelligence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affect hundreds of lives. But as he steps into the slave quarters and takes in the scene, Vicent clutching clerical items, Maria holding a bloody machete, Dom Miguel in chains, and an unconscious Portuguese trader, his composed expression falters. "Sergeant Morrison," he says in crisp English, "your report mentioned irregular circumstances. This appears to be considerably more complex than irregular." Vicent steps forward before the sergeant can respond, addressing the captain in flawless English that carries the refined accent of university education. "Captain Hartwell, I am Deacon Vicent de Silva of the Society of Jesus, illegally enslaved in violation of Portuguese colonial law, international church doctrine, and basic human dignity. I possess evidence of systematic criminal conspiracy involving Portuguese colonial officials, Dutch slave traders, and the deliberate murder of witness in legal proceedings." The captain's eyebrows rise dramatically. In his years of colonial service, he has never encountered an enslaved Catholic deacon who speaks better English than many of his own officers. "Deacon de Silva," he says carefully, testing the title on his tongue, "these are extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence." Vicent unwraps his clerical items again, but this time he also produces something new, a small metal cylinder that has been hidden in the lining of his ragged clothing. Inside the cylinder is a rolled document that, when unfolded, bears official seals from both the Portuguese colonial administration and the Vatican itself. "My ordination certificate," Vicent explains, "along with correspondence from Rome regarding indigenous mission work that Dom Miguel systematically sabotaged for personal profit." He hands the documents to Captain Hartwell with the calm dignity of a man presenting evidence in a formal court proceeding. As the captain examines the papers, his expression grows increasingly grim. International law is clear about the enslavement of ordained clergy. It constitutes a violation of church sovereignty that can justify military intervention by any Catholic nation. England, despite being Protestant, recognizes these diplomatic protocols to maintain relationships with Catholic European powers. "Dear God," Captain Hartwell mutters, then catches himself and looks apologetically at Vicent. "Forgive me, Deacon. This situation has implications far beyond colonial administration." Dom Miguel, who has been listening with growing desperation, suddenly erupts in a torrent of Portuguese that borders on hysteria. He lies. He forges documents. No slave possesses Vatican correspondence. Check the papers, they are false. But Padre Francisco, who has been examining Vicent's documents with the trained eye of a seminary graduate, shakes his head slowly. "The seals are genuine," he says in Portuguese, then switches to broken English for the captain's benefit. "The papers, they are real. This man is truly ordained deacon." The confirmation from another priest removes any lingering doubt about Vicent's identity. Captain Hartwell carefully folds the documents and places them in his jacket with the same reverence he might show for military dispatches from London. "Deacon de Silva, you are hereby placed under official English protection as a representative of the Catholic Church, unlawfully detained by Portuguese colonial authorities." The formal recognition transforms Vicent's status instantly. He is no longer a slave claiming freedom. He is a Catholic clergyman whose rights have been violated by a colonial government that England is already predisposed to distrust. The political implications are staggering. Maria watches this transformation with fascination and growing hope. If Vicent's status can change so dramatically with the production of documents, what might be possible for others? "Captain," she says in careful Portuguese, hoping he might understand, "there are other people here who were free before Dom Miguel enslaved them illegally." Rosa translates Maria's words into broken English, and Captain Hartwell's attention sharpens. "How many others?" he asks through Rosa. Vicent answers before anyone else can speak. At least 12 people on this plantation were illegally enslaved. Maria and Rosa were free women of color who owned property in Salvador before Dom Miguel arranged their capture through false debt claims. Joe here, he gestures toward you, was the son of a freed slave who possessed manumission papers that Dom Miguel destroyed. Your world tilts as Vicent's words sink in. You have lived for 3 years believing yourself to be plantation property, but according to Vicent, you were legally free when Dom Miguel enslaved you. Your father, a man you barely remember, had purchased your freedom before his death, only to have that freedom stolen through document destruction and legal manipulation. The emotional impact is overwhelming. Rage at the theft of your life mingles with confusion about what this revelation means for your future. If you were illegally enslaved, do you have any claim to the life that was stolen from you? Is there a family somewhere who believes you are dead? Captain Hartwell processes this information with the systematic approach of a military administrator. "Sergeant Morrison, I want every person on this plantation interviewed individually. We need to determine legal status, document any evidence of illegal enslavement, and prepare comprehensive reports for colonial authorities." But even as he speaks, the captain's expression suggests he understands the magnitude of what they're uncovering. 12 cases of illegal enslavement on a single plantation implies systematic criminal activity that could involve dozens of other plantations throughout Portuguese colonial territory. The evidence gathering alone could take months. Dom Miguel, sensing that his situation is deteriorating beyond any hope of recovery, makes one final desperate appeal. "Captain, you must understand these people are savages. They require Portuguese guidance. Release them and they will starve or turn to banditry." His words hang in the air like a challenge, and Maria responds with calm dignity that completely undermines his argument. In careful Portuguese directed at Rosa for translation, she outlines a detailed plan for establishing cooperative farming communities where former slaves can grow food crops for local markets rather than export sugar for distant European consumption. Her proposal demonstrates sophisticated understanding of economics, agriculture, and social organization, exactly the kind of knowledge that Dom Miguel claims enslaved people cannot possess. Captain Hartwell listens to Rosa's translation with growing respect for Maria's intelligence and planning abilities. Vicent adds his own perspective in fluent English. "Captain, the greatest tragedy of slavery is not just the theft of labor, but the waste of human potential. Maria was a successful merchant before her illegal enslavement. Rosa managed complex household operations for wealthy Portuguese families. These are not people who require guidance. They are people whose guidance has been stolen from them." The unconscious Portuguese trader chooses this moment to regain consciousness, groaning as he struggles to sit up against the wall. His return to awareness brings with it the immediate problem of what to do with a man who has clearly committed serious crimes, but who might also possess valuable information about broader criminal networks. Captain Hartwell kneels beside the trader and speaks in Portuguese that is heavily accented but functionally adequate. "You are under arrest for illegal slave trafficking. Cooperate with our investigation and you may receive lenient treatment. Refuse to cooperate and you will face the full consequences of English military justice." The trader's response reveals the depth of his desperation. Instead of denying the charges or demanding Portuguese legal representation, he immediately begins offering information about other plantations, other traders, other officials involved in illegal activities. His willingness to betray his confederates demonstrates that he understands the scope of the catastrophe that has befallen the entire criminal network. "There are ships," he babbles in Portuguese mixed with broken English. "Dutch ships in Caribbean waters, Portuguese officials taking payments, plantation owners throughout the coast." His revelations confirm that what's happening on Dom Miguel's plantation is part of a vast criminal conspiracy involving multiple colonial powers. As evening light begins filtering through the windows, casting long shadows across the slave quarters, you realize that this single day has destroyed not just your personal enslavement, but potentially the entire illegal slave trade network along the Brazilian coast. The evidence being gathered here will ripple outward like waves from a dropped stone, affecting thousands of lives across multiple colonial territories. But with liberation comes uncertainty that grows more terrifying as reality sets in. Vicent may have his clerical status to protect him, and Maria may have her merchant skills to support her family, but what about the others? What about the elderly slaves like old Teresa, who can barely walk? What about the children who know nothing but plantation life? Freedom without preparation is its own form of death sentence. Captain Hartwell seems to understand these concerns. "Deacon de Silva," he says formally, "I would be honored to have your assistance in planning transition programs for those who choose to remain in English territory. Your knowledge of both Portuguese colonial law and practical plantation operations would be invaluable." The offer represents more than employment. It's recognition of Vicent's expertise and authority in managing the complex human consequences of liberation. But it also highlights the central challenge facing everyone in this room: learning to live as free people in a world structured around unfree labor. As darkness approaches, English soldiers begin lighting lanterns around the plantation buildings. The warm yellow light seems to promise hope, but it also illuminates the magnitude of the challenges ahead for people whose freedom is only hours old and whose futures remain terrifyingly uncertain. As the lantern light flickers across the quarters, a new sound reaches your ears, the distant rumble of wheels on cobblestone mixed with urgent Portuguese voices. Through the window, you glimpse torches moving along the coastal road toward the plantation. Captain Hartwell immediately recognizes the significance of approaching lights after dark. "Sergeant Morrison, defensive positions," he commands sharply. "We may have Portuguese reinforcements attempting to retake this facility before our documentation is complete." But Vicent shakes his head, his expression troubled rather than fearful. "Captain, those are not military vehicles. The sound is wrong, too heavy, too many wheels. And the voices." He pauses, listening intently to the Portuguese conversations drifting across the night air. "They're discussing prices and transport schedules, not military tactics." Your blood runs cold as Vicent's meaning becomes clear. Other plantation owners have learned about the English intervention and are rushing to evacuate their human property before similar raids can liberate their slaves. The approaching convoy represents a desperate attempt to preserve the slave trade by moving enslaved people beyond English reach. Maria clutches Anna tighter, her knuckles white with tension. "How many plantations are nearby?" she asks Vicent urgently. "7 within a day's travel," Vicent replies grimly. "If they're all attempting to evacuate simultaneously." He doesn't finish the sentence, but everyone understands the implication. Hundreds of enslaved people are being rushed toward ships that will carry them to Caribbean territories where English liberation forces cannot reach them. Captain Hartwell's military instincts immediately grasp the tactical situation. "If we're facing a coordinated evacuation, my current force is insufficient to prevent multiple simultaneous transports." He looks directly at Vicent. "Deacon, You understand these operations better than any of my officers. What are our options? Vicent's answer reveals the strategic intelligence that made him valuable as a clergy member before his enslavement. The coastal road has only 2 deep-water ports suitable for large-scale slave transport within 50 miles. If English naval forces could blockade those ports, the evacuation convoys would be trapped inland with nowhere to deliver their human cargo. The plan is audacious but logistically complex. English ships would need to coordinate with land forces to create an effective blockade, and the timing would be critical too early, and the Portuguese would find alternative routes too late, and the ships would escape with their human cargo. Rosa, who has been quietly listening to the conversation, suddenly speaks up with information that changes everything. Captain, I worked in Dom Miguel's house for 2 years. I saw the correspondence between plantation owners. They have a fallback plan if the English intervene. Captain Hartwell turns his full attention to Rosa. What kind of fallback plan? Rosa's answer sends chills through everyone in the room. If they cannot transport slaves to Caribbean markets, they plan to kill them rather than allow English liberation. They believe dead slaves send a stronger message about Portuguese resolve than freed slaves celebrating English intervention. The horrifying logic is undeniable. From the perspective of Portuguese plantation owners, enslaved people who might testify about illegal activities represent liabilities that become deadly threats under English protection. Mass murder might seem preferable to mass liberation if it prevents evidence from reaching international tribunals. Dom Miguel, still in chains but clearly listening to every word, cannot resist confirming Rosa's revelation with his own twisted perspective. You English fools still don't understand, he sneers. These people exist only as Portuguese property. If Portugal cannot maintain ownership, they have no legitimate existence. Better dead Portuguese property than living English witnesses. His casual discussion of genocide makes even hardened English soldiers step back in revulsion. Captain Hartwell's face hardens with the cold fury of a professional military officer confronting war crimes. Sergeant Morrison, send runners to the naval squadron immediately. Full blockade of all coastal ports within communication range. Priority authorization for any force necessary to prevent mass murder of civilian populations. But Vicent raises a concern that military planning often overlooks. Captain, even if naval blockades prevent ship transport, plantation owners still have other options for eliminating witnesses. Poisoning food supplies, burning buildings with people inside, claiming that slaves died from disease or accidents. The tactical discussion becomes increasingly grim as everyone realizes the multiple ways that desperate plantation owners might attempt to destroy evidence of their crimes. English military intervention has created a situation where enslaved people face immediate danger from their owners' panic rather than gradual death from plantation conditions. Maria makes a suggestion that demonstrates the kind of practical intelligence that has kept her alive for 3 years. What if we don't wait for them to come to us? What if we go to them? Captain Hartwell looks puzzled. Explain. The approaching convoys, Maria says through Rosa's translation. They're moving at night to avoid English patrols, which means they're using back roads and moving slowly. Small groups could intercept them before they reach the ports. Vicent immediately understands Maria's strategic thinking. Interception by former slaves who know the terrain and understand plantation operations would be far more effective than English military pursuit of unknown routes. The proposal is militarily sound but politically explosive. English officers authorizing former slaves to conduct armed operations against Portuguese convoys would represent an unprecedented escalation of colonial conflict. But Captain Hartwell recognizes that conventional military responses are inadequate for the current crisis. The risks are enormous, he says slowly. Armed confrontation between former slaves and Portuguese plantation owners could justify Portuguese claims of English-sponsored rebellion against legitimate colonial authority. But the unconscious Portuguese trader, now fully awake and listening to the conversation, provides information that changes the political calculus entirely. "Captain," he says in broken English mixed with Portuguese, "the plantation owners. They have already sent messages to Lisbon claiming English sponsorship of slave rebellion. They are using this crisis to justify military intervention from Portugal." The revelation transforms the entire situation. Portuguese authorities are already planning to blame England for encouraging slave rebellion, regardless of what actually happens. English restraint will not prevent Portuguese accusations, but English action might prevent Portuguese atrocities. Vicent articulates the moral dimension that military planning sometimes ignores. "Captain, we are discussing the lives of perhaps 1,000 people who will be murdered to prevent their testimony about Portuguese crimes. The political consequences of intervention cannot outweigh the moral obligation to prevent genocide." Anna chooses this moment to cry, not the distressed wailing of earlier, but the simple hunger cry of an infant who needs feeding. The sound cuts through the tactical discussion like a blade, reminding everyone that behind the political and military calculations are real families facing immediate danger. Maria looks down at her daughter, then back at Captain Hartwell with an expression of absolute determination. "I will go," she announces, "with or without English permission. I will not let other children die because adults are afraid of political consequences." Her declaration triggers a cascade of similar commitments from other former slaves throughout the quarters. Rosa volunteers to guide any rescue operations through terrain she knows from years of traveling between plantations. Even old Teresa, who can barely walk, offers to help by sharing information about plantation defenses and guard routines. Captain Hartwell realizes he is witnessing something remarkable: former slaves organizing themselves into a liberation force with better intelligence and stronger motivation than any conventional military unit. Their willingness to risk their newly won freedom to save others still enslaved represents a form of courage that his military training never prepared him to understand. Vicent makes the final argument that convinces the captain to support the rescue operations. "Sir, these people are not asking England to fight their battles for them. They are asking for England's permission to fight their own battles with English support. There is a profound moral difference." The distinction resonates with Captain Hartwell's understanding of English colonial policy, which theoretically supports local self-governance over direct imperial control. Supporting former slaves in their own liberation efforts aligns with stated English values in ways that direct military action might not. "Very well," Captain Hartwell decides. "I authorize limited support for reconnaissance and rescue operations led by local personnel with English military backup." He pauses, then adds with grim determination, "And may God forgive us all if we're wrong about this." As final preparations begin for operations that will either save hundreds of lives or trigger international conflict, you realize that your personal liberation has become part of a historical moment that will reshape colonial relations throughout the Caribbean. The choices made in the next few hours will echo through decades of imperial policy and human rights law. But beyond the historical significance, you face a personal decision that terrifies you more than 3 years of plantation brutality: the choice to risk your new freedom to fight for others who remain enslaved. Freedom, you're discovering, comes with obligations that slavery never required. The decision to join the rescue operation crystallizes in your mind with startling clarity, but it comes accompanied by a terror you've never experienced before. During 3 years of slavery, fear was simple: avoid punishment, survive each day, endure until tomorrow. Now, as a free person choosing to risk that freedom for others, fear becomes complex, layered with responsibility and moral weight that threatens to crush your 15-year-old shoulders. Maria notices your internal struggle and places a calloused hand on your arm. "Joe," she says softly in Portuguese, "freedom means nothing if we use it only to save ourselves." Her words carry the wisdom of someone who has chosen to transform suffering into strength rather than letting it harden into selfishness. Vicen approaches with maps drawn on scraps of paper, rough sketches of plantation locations, road networks, and defensive positions that he's been mentally cataloging for 3 years. The convoy moving along the coastal road includes slaves from the Mendoza plantation, he explains to Captain Hartwell. 43 people, including 8 children under 10 years old. The mention of children triggers something primal in your chest. You remember being 8 years old when Dom Miguel's men took you. Remember the confusion and terror of being separated from everything familiar. The thought of other children experiencing that same horror, multiplied by the desperation of owners willing to commit murder rather than face justice, makes your decision inevitable. "I'm going," you announce, surprising yourself with the firmness in your voice. "I know the back trails between plantations. I can move through terrain where horses can't follow." Captain Hartwell studies you with the appraising look of a military commander evaluating potential assets. "You're 15 years old," he says, not dismissively but with genuine concern. "This operation could involve armed combat against desperate men with nothing left to lose." Rosa laughs, but there's no humor in the sound. "Captain, this boy has survived 3 years on Dom Miguel's plantation. He has already faced armed combat against desperate men every single day of his life." Her observation highlights a truth that conventional military thinking often misses: survival under slavery requires combat skills that regular soldiers never develop. Reading the microexpressions of violent men, anticipating danger from seemingly innocent situations, enduring physical hardship that would break trained warriors, these are skills forged in the hell of plantation life. Vicen adds his own assessment. "Joel understands plantation psychology better than any English officer could. He knows how overseers think, how they react under pressure, what mistakes they make when plans go wrong." He pauses, then adds with quiet emphasis, "And he knows what slavery feels like, which means he understands exactly what we're fighting to prevent." The Portuguese trader, still conscious and apparently hoping to purchase lenient treatment through cooperation, provides tactical intelligence that no one expected. "The Mendoza convoy," he says in broken English. "They carry extra guards because they transport high-value slaves. Skilled craftsmen, educated house servants, people who could testify about financial crimes." His revelation adds urgency to the rescue planning. High-value slaves face greater danger because their testimony could implicate Portuguese officials at the highest levels of colonial administration. Plantation owners will go to extraordinary lengths to prevent such witnesses from reaching English protection. Maria makes a suggestion that demonstrates her merchant background. "We approach this like a business transaction," she says through Rosa's translation. "What do the convoy guards want most? What are they afraid of losing? How do we make cooperation more profitable than resistance?" Vicen immediately grasps her strategic thinking. The guards are hired Portuguese soldiers, not plantation overseers. They're paid to deliver cargo, not to die defending it. If we can make resistance more costly than surrender. Captain Hartwell nods approvingly. Classic military psychology. Present your opponent with choices where cooperation serves their self-interest better than conflict. He looks around the room at the assembled former slaves. This approach requires more sophistication than simple armed confrontation. The planning session that follows reveals the extraordinary intelligence and creativity that slavery has been wasting for generations. Rosa contributes detailed knowledge of guard rotations and defensive procedures from her years in plantation houses. Maria provides insights into the economic calculations that drive Portuguese decision-making. Vicent offers legal and political context that helps predict how various scenarios might unfold. You contribute your own expertise, knowledge of the terrain, understanding of how plantation convoys move through difficult country, and most importantly, ability to move through darkness and underbrush with the stealth that comes from years of avoiding unwanted attention from overseers. As the detailed plan emerges, you realize you're participating in something unprecedented. Former slaves, using their intimate knowledge of the plantation system to systematically dismantle it. The oppressive structure that created your suffering is now providing the tools for liberation operations that conventional military forces could never execute. But the emotional weight of the mission grows heavier as specific details become clear. The convoy includes families that will be separated permanently if they reach the ships, children who will grow up in Caribbean sugar hell if tonight's operation fails, elderly people who will be worked to death within months if they're transported beyond English protection. Anna starts fussing again, and Maria's attention immediately shifts to her daughter's needs. Watching her balance maternal instincts with liberation planning highlights the impossible choices that freedom creates. As a slave, Maria's only responsibility was survival. As a free woman, she must choose between personal safety and moral obligation to others still suffering. There's something else, Vicent says quietly, producing yet another hidden document from his seemingly inexhaustible collection. This plantation maintains detailed records of slave sales to other Portuguese territories. If we can intercept those records along with the human cargo. Captain Hartwell's eyes widen as he processes the implications. Documentary evidence of systematic illegal trafficking could justify English intervention in Portuguese colonial affairs for decades. The mission is expanding beyond simple rescue into intelligence gathering that could reshape international law regarding slavery and colonial administration. But with expanded objectives comes expanded risk. Portuguese forces will fight much harder to protect incriminating documents than they would to retain human cargo. Rosa raises a practical concern that threatens to complicate everything. What happens to people we rescue? Where do they go? How do they eat? Her questions highlight the gap between liberation and sustainable freedom that English colonial policy has not adequately addressed. Vicent's answer reveals planning that extends far beyond tonight's immediate crisis. Captain Hartwell has authorized the establishment of settlement communities on English territory, with agricultural support and basic education programs. He pauses, then adds with a slight smile, and the Catholic Church has offered to provide educational resources through mission programs. The prospect of legitimate education, learning to read, write, and calculate beyond the minimal skills required for plantation survival seems almost too miraculous to believe. You have spent 3 years accepting that intellectual development was forever beyond your reach, reserved for white colonial elites who controlled economic and political power. But even as hope grows, practical fears multiply. Combat experience from plantation survival is not the same as military operations against armed Portuguese soldiers. The tactical skills that helped you avoid beatings might not transfer to situations involving muskets and coordinated defensive positions. Captain Hartwell seems to read your concerns. You'll be accompanied by English soldiers with military training, he assures you. Your role is guidance and intelligence, not solo combat against professional forces. The commitment of English military support provides reassurance, but it also highlights the international significance of tonight's operations. English soldiers firing on Portuguese colonial forces in defense of former slaves will create diplomatic consequences that could affect European relations for generations. As final preparations near completion, Dom Miguel makes one last desperate attempt to undermine the rescue mission. "You fools!" he shouts from his chains. The other plantation owners are expecting English interference. They have prepared ambushes along the most likely approach routes. His warning might be truth, lies, or simple psychological warfare designed to discourage the rescue attempt. But Vicent's response suggests that the possibility of ambush has already been considered and planned for. "Dom Miguel, your desperate warnings only confirm that tonight's mission is necessary," Vicent says calmly. "If plantation owners are prepared for armed resistance, it means they know their actions are indefensible under any legitimate legal system." The sun has completely set now, and the plantation compound is lit only by English military lanterns that cast dancing shadows across buildings that have witnessed 3 years of your suffering. In a few hours, you'll either be helping to liberate others from similar suffering, or you'll be dead in Portuguese ambush positions along darkened roads. But for the first time since your enslavement began, you're facing danger as a free person making your own choices rather than as property being used by others for their purposes. The terror is overwhelming, but it's your terror, chosen rather than imposed. The transformation feels like rebirth, painful, disorienting, but ultimately liberating in ways that extend far beyond simple physical freedom. The operation begins at midnight with a silence so profound that your heartbeat seems to thunder in your ears. You move through the darkness alongside Maria, Rosa, Vicent, and 6 English soldiers whose faces are blackened with charcoal to blend with the night. Captain Hartwell leads the group with military precision, but he defers to your local knowledge when choosing paths through the dense Brazilian undergrowth. The terrain you've known only as a prison for 3 years now becomes your ally. Every twisted root, every low-hanging branch, every hidden creek bed that once represented obstacles to escape now provides tactical advantages for rescue operations. The irony is not lost on you. The same landscape that trapped you as a slave is helping you liberate others from identical bondage. Maria carries Anna strapped to her chest, the baby somehow sensing the need for absolute quiet. Rosa moves with surprising stealth for someone who spent years working in plantation houses rather than fields. Vicent, despite his age and recent ordeal, displays the disciplined movement of someone accustomed to navigating dangerous situations with calculated precision. The first convoy comes into view just after 1 o'clock in the morning, a line of wagons creaking along the coastal road, their wheels muffled with cloth but still audible to ears trained by years of hypervigilance. Through the darkness, you can make out the silhouettes of chained figures packed into wooden carts like cargo being transported to market. Captain Hartwell signals for the group to halt while he surveys the convoy through a brass telescope. His whispered assessment confirms your worst fears. 43 people as reported, 8 guards, 2 drivers, children visible in the second wagon. He pauses, then adds grimly, and what appears to be a powder keg mounted near the human cargo. The powder keg represents the ultimate expression of Portuguese desperation. If rescue seems likely, they're prepared to detonate explosives that will kill enslaved people rather than allow their liberation. The casual willingness to commit mass murder rather than face economic loss encapsulates everything monstrous about the slave system. Vicent's tactical assessment is delivered with the cold logic of someone who has witnessed Portuguese brutality for 3 years. The powder keg is intimidation as much as genuine threat, he whispers. Detonation would destroy valuable cargo and create evidence of mass murder that even Portuguese authorities couldn't ignore in international tribunals. But Maria's response highlights the emotional reality behind tactical calculations. Intimidation that could murder my sister's children if the guards panic, she breathes. We cannot assume rational behavior from desperate men. The approach requires split-second timing and perfect coordination. English soldiers will create diversions that draw guards away from the wagons, while former slaves move in to release shackles and guide escapees into the forest. Any miscommunication or premature action could trigger the catastrophic violence that everyone is trying to prevent. You find yourself assigned to the most dangerous role, approaching the wagon containing children while Rosa and Maria handle adult prisoners. Your small size and ability to move silently through undergrowth make you the logical choice, but the responsibility feels crushing. 8 children's lives depend on your ability to pick locks, cut ropes, and guide terrified young people through darkness toward uncertain freedom. The operation begins with English soldiers creating noise and movement on the far side of the convoy, drawing Portuguese guards toward what appears to be an attempted ambush. As planned, the guards react with military instincts that pull them away from their human cargo toward the perceived threat. You slip through the darkness toward the children's wagon, your hands shaking as you work to free shackles with tools provided by English soldiers. The first child you encounter is a girl perhaps 6 years old, her eyes wide with terror that transforms to confusion as you whisper urgent explanations in Portuguese. Sujo, you tell her, using your real name for the first time in 3 years. Vuti levar para a liberdade. The words feel strange on your tongue, promising freedom to someone else when your own liberation is only hours old. The other children respond with the mixture of hope and suspicion that characterizes all plantation interactions. They want to believe rescue is possible, but 3 years of betrayed expectations have taught them to distrust anything that seems too good to be true. Your own recent enslavement helps you understand their emotional state in ways that would be impossible for someone who had never experienced plantation bondage. As shackles fall away and children begin moving toward the forest under your guidance, you hear sounds that make your blood freeze. Portuguese voices raised in alarm as guards discover the diversionary tactics. The carefully planned operation is about to become a chaotic confrontation with lives hanging in the balance. Maria's voice cuts through the darkness from the adult wagon. "Joe, get the children away from here, now." Her tone carries the urgent authority of someone who sees danger developing faster than planned. You guide 8 confused and terrified children into the undergrowth, just as musket fire erupts behind you. The sound of English and Portuguese soldiers exchanging shots creates a backdrop of violence that threatens to traumatize young people who have already endured more than any child should face. But something remarkable happens as you move through the forest with your young charges. The oldest boy, perhaps 10 years old, begins helping the younger children navigate fallen logs and thorny bushes. A girl of 8 takes the hand of her crying companion and whispers reassurances in Portuguese mixed with what sounds like an African language. Even in their fear and confusion, these children display the resilience and mutual support that has kept enslaved communities alive for generations. The rendezvous point where English soldiers promise to meet escaping slaves is a clearing beside a stream, chosen for its defensible position and access to fresh water. As you arrive with the children, you find Vicent already there with a group of adults whose faces show the exhausted relief of people who have given up hope of ever experiencing freedom. Rosa appears moments later, guiding an elderly couple who move slowly but with dignity intact despite their ordeal. Maria arrives last, carrying Anna while helping a pregnant woman whose condition makes rapid movement impossible. The sight of families being reunited after forced separation creates an emotional intensity that threatens to overwhelm your ability to function. But the celebration is premature. Captain Hartwell's arrival brings news that dampens the joy of successful rescue. "We've liberated 41 people from this convoy, but Portuguese messengers escaped to warn other plantation owners. The evacuation is accelerating, and we may not be able to intercept additional convoys before they reach deepwater ports." Vicent's response demonstrates the strategic thinking that has kept him alive through 3 years of slavery. "Captain, perhaps we're approaching this incorrectly. Instead of trying to intercept multiple convoys, what if we make convoy transportation impossible?" His suggestion involves a level of tactical sophistication that impresses even experienced English officers. By destroying key bridges and blocking essential road sections, small groups could make large-scale slave transport logistically impossible without direct confrontation with armed guards. The engineering challenges are significant, but the psychological impact could be even greater. Portuguese plantation owners who discover that their evacuation routes have been systematically destroyed might conclude that continued resistance is futile rather than escalating to increasingly desperate measures. As dawn breaks over the forest clearing where 41 people are experiencing their first sunrise as free individuals, you realize that last night's operation has accomplished something beyond simple rescue. It has demonstrated that former slaves possess the intelligence, courage, and organizational ability to dismantle the system that oppressed them. The children you guided through the darkness are now playing beside the stream, their laughter a sound you haven't heard in 3 years. The adults are discussing plans for establishing communities, sharing skills for growing food and building shelter, organizing educational programs for their children. Vicen approaches you as you watch the scene unfold. "Joe," he says, using your name with the respect that free people show each other, "you have discovered something important about freedom." "What?" you ask. His answer carries the wisdom of someone who has experienced enslavement, liberation, and the complex journey between them. Freedom is not something you receive from others. It is something you create by taking action to ensure that others can experience it as well. Maria joins the conversation, Anna sleeping peacefully in her arms after the night's excitement. "The English soldiers were brave and skilled," she says, "but they could never have accomplished what we did last night. They don't understand plantation life, don't know how enslaved people think and feel, don't have the motivation that comes from personal experience of bondage." The observation highlights a truth that will reshape your understanding of liberation movements for the rest of your life. Sustainable freedom requires not just external support from sympathetic allies, but internal organization and action by people who understand oppression from the inside. Captain Hartwell approaches with final reports from the night's operations. "Portuguese authorities are requesting negotiations," he announces. "They're offering to discuss gradual emancipation in exchange for ending what they're calling English-sponsored slave rebellions." Vicen's laugh contains decades of bitter experience with Portuguese promises. "Captain, gradual emancipation means maintaining slavery while creating the appearance of moral progress. It's a negotiating tactic designed to preserve the profitable aspects of the system while eliminating international criticism." But Maria sees opportunity in the Portuguese willingness to negotiate. "What if we make them an offer they cannot refuse?" she suggests. "What if we offer to stop liberation operations in exchange for immediate, complete emancipation with full documentation of legal status for all enslaved people in Portuguese territory?" The proposal is audacious. Using the threat of continued rescue operations to force comprehensive abolition, rather than accepting gradual reforms that could preserve slavery for decades. But it requires maintaining pressure that could escalate into open warfare between English and Portuguese colonial forces. Vicent provides the historical perspective that frames the current moment in larger context. "We are living through the collapse of the Portuguese colonial slave system," he says with quiet satisfaction. "Our actions last night have accelerated that collapse, but the fundamental contradictions were already making the system unsustainable." As the sun climbs higher and the rescued children's laughter grows louder, you understand that your personal journey from slavery to freedom has become part of a historical transformation that will affect millions of lives across multiple continents. The choices you made in the darkness have contributed to changes that will reshape international law, colonial policy, and human rights discourse for generations. But beyond the historical significance, you have discovered something about yourself that 3 years of slavery could not destroy. You are capable of courage, intelligence, and moral action that extends beyond simple survival. Freedom has revealed capacities that bondage had hidden but never eliminated. The plantation where you suffered for 3 years is now visible in the distance, smoke rising from buildings being searched by English soldiers for additional evidence of Portuguese crimes. The place that once represented the entirety of your world has become simply one location among many where you might choose to live, work, and contribute to building something better than what came before. Anna wakes in Maria's arms and looks up at the sky with the pure curiosity of a child seeing sunlight, without the shadow of bondage hanging over her future. Her innocent wonder encapsulates the promise and responsibility of freedom, the opportunity to create a world where children can grow up without experiencing the horrors that shaped your own early life. As you prepare to leave the forest clearing for whatever comes next, you carry with you not just personal liberation but participation in a transformation that will echo through history. The story of one 15-year-old boy who chose to risk his freedom to ensure that others could experience theirs becomes part of the larger story of how enslaved people freed themselves through courage, intelligence, and mutual support that no amount of oppression could permanently destroy. Freedom, you have learned, is not a destination but a continuous process of ensuring that human dignity survives and flourishes, even in the face of systems designed to destroy it.